Gospel reading today is John 2, 1 through 11. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This is the word of the Lord. The story of Jesus turning water into wine contains what a philosopher who was very popular in the late 20th century, Paul Ricoeur, used to call a metaphorical twist. Ricoeur studied Jesus' parables quite a bit, and he wrote about them. And he noted that they contained this, what he called metaphorical twist. And he called them extended metaphors. You know, a metaphor is just a little sentence. What was it in Isaiah? Isaiah says that Israel will be a crown of beauty. Well, Israel wasn't really a crown, a beautiful crown. That was a metaphor, right? Well, Ricoeur observed that these little stories of Jesus, by which Jesus taught, with characters and a plot, a storyline, at some point in the story there would be this little twist. It would be an oddness that would make you go, "What?" And you'd have to stop and think and ponder and listen and make some meaning if the story is going to reveal its meaning. And so here's an example. Here's one of Jesus' parables. A vineyard owner leaves town, leaves workers in charge. They work the vineyards, and then it's time for the harvest. They start harvesting the grapes, and the owner sends servants back to get the grapes. What do the owners do? They kill the servants. Here's where the oddness starts. The owner says, "Well, I'll send some more servants and get the grapes." That was kind of stupid, wasn't it? What do the workers do? They kill the second set of servants. And then the real oddness is there. The owner says, "Well, maybe they'll respect my son." He sends his son. And what happens? The son is killed too. Now, the Pharisees, the chief priests, they knew about parables, and they stopped and they did some thinking, and then they realized that, Jesus is telling a story about us. And we're not the good guys in the story. And they didn't like it. Well, the story of Jesus turning water into wine is like one of Jesus' parables. It contains the metaphorical twist, the oddness. But where is the oddness in this story? Now, the oddness is when the mother of Jesus starts inserting herself into the business that really belongs to the wine steward. There's a problem. And she's a guest, and she should have left it But the oddness continues when she turns to Jesus and wants him to fix it. That's kind of strange, I think. And Jesus was right, wasn't he? And saying, well, wait a minute, what's that to me? Let that guy take care of it. So, we got to stop. We got to ask, well, why did Mary do that? It seems odd. We got to ponder. We got to think. We got to listen to our inner being. And here's what bubbled up in me this time. It bubbled up in me that the wedding represents, or the wedding celebration represents the celebratory, loving, joyful quality of life that God intended. And running out of wine represents an event that threatens to disrupt or even destroy that wonderful quality of life that God intends. And that disruption, that destruction is evil. That's where evil resides. And you know, we can identify lots of types of situations that are evil at all different levels of life. You know, sometimes a misspoken word that brings pain has some evil in it. A sudden rush of anger that disrupts your relationship brings evil. Clinging to resentments and failing to forgive, even though God has taught you to forgive, brings evil. It disrupts that beautiful quality of life. And then on a larger scale, a society can oppress a group of people in that society. You know, we oppressed Africans when we brought them here and made them slaves. That was evil. And then on the world scene, a dictator can starve his people in the name of war. It's happening right now in Syria. That awful dictator is not letting aid workers get to a little town outside of Damascus where people have already starved to death. Babies are starving as we speak. That is evil. Sometimes we point to people like that dictator. He's an evil person. He's doing evil things that hurts others. Sometimes evil's just in the mix. Nobody's really evil, but things happen and it feels evil. I saw this last week. There was a man who had a daughter of 12 years old, and she didn't go to school that day, and that morning a police officer came to the door with orders to evict that family from that apartment or house. And so the man opens the door, the father opens the door and sees the police, shuts the door, opens it again, and has a rifle, and he's pointing the rifle right at the police officer. Now that's not a good thing to do, but the man was not a dictator. And immediately the officer drew his weapon. This is in the paper. This is a story that really happened this last week. The officer drew his gun and fired. The bullet hit the man in the arm but went on through, and the officer didn't know the daughter was behind the father, struck the daughter, the 12-year-old daughter, in the neck and killed her. Now, the next door neighbor's daughter was a playmate of the 12-year-old, and the next door neighbor lamented, how am I going to tell my child about this? It's like nobody was just personification of evil, even though some bad things were going on. But evil just seemed to reside in the situation, you know? And since evil destroys or hurts life as it was meant to be, then we need justice. And justice is what heals those disruptions that threaten the celebratory, loving, joyful quality of life, and therefore enables these qualities to be restored. So we need justice. But justice can be hard to come by. It can be hard to find, can't it? Sometimes justice is so difficult to find that we think we need a miracle. We need God to bring justice to heal the nations. But sometimes it seems that God is very reticent to bring justice, you know? Just like Jesus was reluctant to do anything about the lack of wine at the party. Now there is a wonderful author named Toni Morrison who wrote a book called Beloved. And in that book, a white mountain girl named Amy Denver aids a runaway slave named Sethi, who was a young woman who was pregnant. Now, Amy sees the back of Sethi, and she's shocked. Her back is bloody. It is torn from the whip of the slave owner. And Amy is shocked and amazed at the degree of mutilation. And so she utters these words. Come here, Jesus. Wonder what God had in mind. Justice can be hard to come by. But the story of Jesus turning water into wine does show us what God did have in mind. And that is abundance. Abundance of justice and mercy. The water became the finest wine. And the event that threatened the celebration of the wedding was ended. But you know what? Even so, Mary, the mother, and by the way, John never names Mary in the whole gospel. It's always just the mother of Jesus. But she had to nudge Jesus, had to prod Jesus to get Jesus to act. And she gives us a clue then that we too sometimes have to nudge God, prod God and say, God, please come help. We need a miracle. We need justice. And you know what? In our lifetime, at least many of our lifetimes, if you're young enough, you did live through this, but it's still a modern thing. We have seen a miracle in modern times. And in our time, we have seen this miracle come to being through the prophetic ministry of Martin Luther King Jr. He was a lot like Mary. He brought some oddness. He brought a metaphorical twist into the situation of segregation and racism. You know, well into the 20th century, black people were still being lynched from trees. And you can see the pictures and you can see how gut-wrenching it is. All the signs, only whites, whites only. No eating at a restaurant, no drinking out of the water fountain, no using the bathroom, no going to the good school, no nothing. So Martin Luther King Jr. brought some oddness, brought that metaphorical twist into the situation. And you know what that was? That twist, that oddness, it was the way he said, we're going to deal with this. Now, typically, if you're a minority and you are really, really being oppressed and it has ruined that celebratory, loving, joyful quality of life, there's going to be violence. That's how you save it. The American Revolution, that was violent. The Civil War brought a little justice, didn't it? But it was violent. Martin Luther King Jr. said, well, we're not going to be passive. We're not going to take it anymore, on the one hand. On the other hand, he said, we're not going to be violent, like everybody assumes you have to be. He said, we're going to have non-violent resistance. And there's the oddness. Who on the face of it thinks that that is going to work? In his I Have a Dream speech in 1963, he gave a wonderful explanation of nonviolent resistance. Just listen to these words. We must forever conduct our struggles on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. And so with soul force, he led the people to resist segregation nonviolently, going into the restaurants, defying those whites-only signs, and being willing to go to jail if that were the consequence. Through such actions and marches and protests and preaching and teaching, you know what he was doing? He was lifting up these disruptive, evil situations. And he was saying, come here, Jesus. Wonder what God had in mind. And then God just nudged, or Martin nudged God, prodded God to bring justice, to turn water into wine. And you know what? God did. And God did so abundantly. Segregation ended. The Civil Rights Act came into being in 1964. Schools got integrated. And obviously, there's a long way to go still. We still wrestle with racism, but we don't wrestle with that awful segregation like we did. And of course, Martin paid the ultimate price of being killed as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, I have a picture of that balcony. And on that balcony stands Amy. And I was going to bring it this morning, and I left it sitting at home. And I'm sorry about that. But I want to tell you, this was in like, what, the late 80s? Or,
It was before Thomas was born.
yeah, well, okay, late 70s, early 80s.
Mid-80s.
Mid-80s, okay, mid-80s. We got it now. Okay, mid-80s. Well, mid-late 80s. All right. So, the Memphis Ministerial Association each year would have a memorial service on the date of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. And so it came time for it, and Amy that year was treasurer of the Memphis Ministerial Association. And so she helped to lead the service. And the picture is of her doing her part, leading the service. The leader stood on the balcony, and everyone else was below, because the balcony wasn't too high. And Amy said that in that service, she got to hear a whole group of Protestant ministers and Jewish rabbis reminisce about their experiences the day that Martin Luther King died, and then soon after, when the whole city had a memorial service for this dead prophet. And it was held at Crump Stadium, big old football stadium, outdoors. And now these rabbis and pastors, they were older at that point, but back when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, they were a young generation of clergy. And she remembers how one rabbi told about leaving his house to go to that memorial service to help lead it. And he told his family goodbye. And he was so scared. He was afraid he'd never come back. Because, as you can imagine, the city was a tinderbox. It could explode in violence. Even just driving to the stadium would be scary. But fortunately, Nothing happened, and the service went off without any violence. Today, may our memorial be our determination to point toward the injustice and evil in our world and that is of our day. And may we say, "Come here, Jesus. What do you think God had in mind?" And may we, like Mary and Martin, nudge God, prod God, in the hope of God's miracle of justice, when the water of evil will be transformed into the wine of justice. And there will be healing. And that celebratory, loving, and joyful quality of life will be restored.